A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I'm writing this because if I don't, the memory will consume me. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and for almost half my life, I've harbored a secret that has haunted me since childhood, a secret that recently spilled out and shattered my younger brother's perception of his most cherished memory. 14 years ago, we spent an idyllic summer at our family's lake cabin, where the highlight was a photo of my 6-year-old brother, Daniel, catching his first fish. In that moment, he beamed with an ear-to-ear grin, the sun reflecting off the lake's surface, framing him in what seemed like pure magic. But the truth? That photo was a lie. I'd photoshopped the image to replace a snapshot of him in tears, furious at not being able to haul in the fish I'd caught earlier. I did it to preserve not just his childhood pride but my own. I wanted to be the perfect big sister, the one who always made things better. For years, I let him believe he was a fishing prodigy, a glorious little angler destined for greatness, and I felt like I was doing right by him. However, guilt festered in me, a festering wound pretending to be a scar, and as life would have it, I plotted my confession, trying to plan it in the least destructive way. Yet, the worst time came a few nights ago when Daniel, now a confident 20-year-old with dreams of being a marine biologist, wanted to use that photograph for a presentation on childhood memories. That's when the truth slipped from my mouth like a dark shadow breaking free, the realization that my brother's most treasured moment was nothing more than a fabrication. I watched the joy in his eyes fade until they were eclipsed by confusion and betrayal. I initially thought admitting it meant I'd cleanse my conscience, but it only unleashed a raging storm in him, a tempest of hurt and anger that left him reeling. I thought he'd laugh it off, surely he wouldn't hold it against me. But as I witnessed disbelief morphing slowly into hurt, it dawned on me that I had stripped him of a part of his innocence, weaponized what was supposed to be a simple memory, turning it into a cruel joke that twisted his childhood in ways I never anticipated. "Why would you do that?" he demanded, his voice barely cracking but laced with a boiling fury that felt alien yet terrifyingly real. "It was my moment. You took that from me, and for what? A stupid story?" The pain in his voice cut deeper than any blade, and I crumbled. I never expected to feel this insignificance take root in me, as if I had turned back time and was faced with an immense weight of responsibility. I tried to explain my motives, how I thought I was protecting him, yet my words felt hollow against the backdrop of his devastated expression. That night, he walked out, leaving me alone in that cabin, its walls suddenly closing in on me, each of our shared memories mocking me with their cheerful nostalgia while I was engulfed in darkness. I spent the following hours replays in my mind. What if I'd told him earlier? What if I'd let him have those painful moments? I kept him safe, but I kept him small, shrunk him into this tiny box of falsehoods, and now he wouldn't speak to me. I tossed and turned until dawn, visions of my brother's face swirling, the hurt, confusion, and disgust straining and pulling within me. As I watched the first light of morning creep through the curtains, I made a decision. I needed to do more than just apologize. I needed to show him the truth behind the photo, the real memories, the harshness of life that accompanied growing up. That's when I turned to the internet, diving into every forum, every advice column I could find on how to mend the rifts in family dynamics, how to deal with guilt when it's intertwined with love. It was then that I stumbled onto something strange, a post titled "Twisted Memories, What Would You Do?" The comments flooded my vision, ranging from empathy to outright hostility. It was as if the world had taken their collective traumas and laid them bare for the sake of my enlightenment. Each tale was unique yet framed by a common theme, the struggle of truth versus illusion. Among them, a single comment stood out, a user claiming to have once erased a sibling's memory too. She wrote of a photograph that had twisted a sibling's childhood with dark magic. At first, it seemed absurd, but the more I read, the more I felt a chill creeping down my spine. The user shared that after years of sharing fabricated stories, the guilt manifested as something more sinister. She claimed that reality had warped around her lie, that she began to see glimpses of future memories that became nightmares, shadows that crawled into existence, feeding off the deception. As I read the comment, my heart started to race. I didn't want to spiral, but how could I ignore the uncanny parallels to my life? I decided that if Daniel wouldn't come back to me, I needed to find my own path through the chaos of guilt. I returned to the cabin, armed with the intent to face this truth head-on, and there I felt the weight of those walls close in on me once again, my own memories whispering doubts and fears. I pulled out my phone, wanting to salvage what remained of our bond, and scrolled through old pictures, each swipe sending jolts of nostalgia through me, reminding me of the little boy who had looked up to me for everything. When I stumbled upon the photo in question, there it was, the fake image that haunts me now, the one that ripped away Daniel's childhood dream like a thief in the night. But instead of just darkness, a flicker of something else caught my attention. In one corner of the picture, hidden in the shadows, a figure stood barely visible, unusually distorted, as if it were a reflection of something highly malevolent, its fingers stretched, reaching toward Daniel, the fish eerily vibrant yet dead in his innocent grasp. My heart raced. The comment I had dismissed now felt like a warning. I was about to delete the image, when the memory of that summer clamped down harder than ever. The shadows of our childhood somehow now felt as if they'd been alive all along. The fish, once a token of triumph, now felt like a whisper of something sinister, a memory turned into a potential nightmare, a cycle I had started. Suddenly, the cabin ambience shifted, it felt oppressive, and the air thickened with unshakable dread as I glanced towards the window where a chill breeze swept through, chilling the hair on my arms. There, lurking in the shadows where I'd once seen joy, I perceived movement, just a flicker, but enough to send a cold tremor up my spine. I raced outside, desperate to make sense of what I cropped out all those years ago, hoping to recover the essence of that moment and shield my brother from the darkness that might have crept within our lives through my deceit. What if, in the echoes of my defense, I had unleashed something more sinister, something festering all those years, waiting for the right moment to strike? I took a deep breath as I faced the lake, where sunlight danced innocently across the surface, but the memory of that photo lingered like a stain. I vowed to Daniel that I would rectify this mistake. It wouldn't matter how awful the truth was, it needed to be told. As I plunged into the water, each stroke burned with purpose, with the resolve to collect remnants of the past, to confront whatever shadows had twisted our truth. It took 2 agonizing hours, the sun slipping down the horizon by the time I emerged victorious. I held a rusted fishing lure in my grasp, the very one I recalled tossing in frustration during that summer. As everything fell into place in my mind, I felt a chill run through me, not at the lure but at how dark and twisted my path had become. When I finally returned to shore, I felt different, lighter, yet the shadows lingered, as if darkness intertwined with my essence. As I faced the cabin, knowing I had to confront Daniel, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The shadows seemed to stir, almost mocking me. But I made my way back to the cabin, with each step weighted by that rusty lure, hoping with every part of me to reconcile this burden of childhood illusions before it engulfed us both. And there I found him on the porch, lost in thought, vulnerable, shattered, and staring aimlessly at the fading light. "Daniel," I started, but the tremble in my voice echoed doubts that swirled in the still air. Would my truth be enough? Would it even matter? I hugged the lure to my chest, and as darkness fell around us, I took another step, knowing I still had my own damning shadows to face, a tale woven together by our secrets. I never thought a simple act of sharing leftovers could tear my family apart, but here I am, sitting alone in my darkened living room, replaying that moment over and over, haunted by the consequences of my actions. My wife, Julia, owns a small but trendy restaurant in the heart of the city, and her passion for crafting the perfect menu is only matched by her relentless pursuit of culinary excellence. Last week, she prepared a spectacular feast for an important food critic, and despite the hours she labored over the dishes, it was a complete disaster. A botched soufflé and an unseasoned risotto meant for a table of 6 ended with her in tears and a table full of critics who abandoned their forks. Luckily, we had leftovers, and while I didn't think much of it at the time, I saw them as a potential treat for our 7-year-old son, Jeremy, who had been particularly picky lately. After a long day of work, I was exhausted and did what any parent would do. I heated up the remains of Julia's masterpiece, set it on the table, and watched as Jeremy devoured it, his delighted expressions making it feel like I had done something right. Little did I know, Julia returned home just moments later, her exhaustion quickly transforming into an explosive rage. She was furious when she learned I'd given her hard work to our child without asking her, saying that the food wasn't fit for a child and that it was a culinary embarrassment to have it enjoyed in our home. I tried to explain that I was merely trying to avoid a food wasteland, that I thought the meal was still tasty regardless of her standards, but every point I made only seemed to enrage her more. As the evening spiraled out of control, I had every intention of smoothing things over, only for the situation to morph from her yelling into accusations that my actions were disrespectful not only to her work but to her as a person, as if I had taken something far more valuable than overcooked risotto and an unappetizing soufflé. I felt as though I was losing my grasp on both my wife and the situation, and so did the unthinkable. Under the weight of her disappointment and anger, I snapped back at her, suggesting she should have been more focused on the food quality and less on the critics. How easy it was for her to blame me for a problem that simmered deeper. It was the moment she turned silent, eyes glaring, that I realized the words had crossed an irretrievable line, that I had launched us into a war I never intended to start. For days afterward, the silence felt like a living thing, hovering over our home, punctuated only by Jeremy's innocent inquiries about why Mommy seemed so upset. Julia's repertoire of silence was filled with passive-aggressive remarks and cold, short responses, her eyes narrowing when I tried to engage in anything beyond the bare minimum of conversation necessary to ensure the basic functions of family life, a stark contrast to the vivacious, affectionate woman I had fallen in love with. I had hoped we'd recover after the initial fallout, but instead, Julia's resentment festered, and soon it morphed into something darker, something almost devoid of love and warmth. She became distant, pouring herself into work at the restaurant, where she would stay late and celebrate a new batch of customers with food I wondered if she served with love or simply out of spite for me. And then came the night I sat down at my computer, typing an online thread about the entire situation. I titled it "Ida for giving my kid my wife's restaurant leftovers." I poured out everything that had transpired, desperate for an outside perspective, only to be met with a storm of judgment, thousands declaring that I was the ultimate not only for disregarding her cooking but for taking away her art without even asking. The comments cut deeper than Julia's shrillest reprimands, each one a dagger twisting in my heart. Did I truly not appreciate her work? Did I really ruin what little glimmer of happiness we shared? In a whirlwind of frustration and guilt, I posted it, hoping maybe some kind souls would understand my side, but I only sunk deeper into despair. I couldn't see my reflection in her eyes anymore. It was as if she were gazing at a stranger, one who had cheated her out of validation and respect. Days turned into weeks filled with awkward dinners and increasingly frequent texts from concerned friends, worried about the cracks forming in our once solid relationship, while I spiraled into a pit of confusion and sadness. By now, any semblance of peace was gone. When I finally approached Julia to talk, her reaction was icy as she bristled and turned her back on me, my heart breaking at the sight of her shoulders hunched, each part of her signaling the grief I had caused. I tried to muster the strength to fight for our family, but it crumbled like stale bread, and Jeremy ended up sandwiched in between our personal warfare, his innocent laughter becoming a haunting reminder of our shared happiness, a skin-deep gallery of memory eclipsed by an ominous cloud. I racked my head trying to fix things, bring back that laughter, but all I found was bitterness, a constant reminder that I was perhaps wholly to blame. The last straw came on the night when Jeremy begged us to take him out to eat. I attempted to suggest we go to Julia's restaurant, a familiar comfort, but she scowled, her face freezing in a way I had understatedly believed was an unthinkable facet of my once joyful wife, and she snapped that she would rather eat trash than step foot in a place bearing my name. I had turned to Jeremy, hoping his innocent spirit could bridge the chasm between us, and when I caught a glimpse of disappointment in his eyes, I knew I had failed. Days turned into months, and everything I tried had been met with veiled hostility. I became a ghost in my own home, a failure neither of us knew how to fix, and one afternoon, a provocative thought pricked at the edges of my mind. Maybe if she couldn't see the value in me anymore, perhaps it was time to remove myself from the equation, let Julia and Jeremy continue thriving without the emotional wreckage that had invaded our lives. So, when I quietly packed a bag and slipped out the door for one last stroll, leaving my phone behind in my attempt to free us from the chaos, I thought it was the right decision. As evening settled in, I found myself wandering toward Julia's restaurant, every step heavy with resolve to push through the hurt, to give closure to my irreparable mistakes. Standing outside the bright lights and vibrant people, I took a breath to gather the courage. I was finally going to admit my faults and appeal for forgiveness, but as I stepped inside, I was greeted not with the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals but by the sight of Julia beside a tall man with an easy grin, laughing over plates that I'd once served my family. Suddenly, I found myself at the precipice of realization. In seeking to share a simple meal with my son, I had unwittingly starved the love in our home, and now it looked as though I had ushered in someone else's warmth. Maybe the leftovers were more than just food, maybe they were a reflection of the way I threw away months of fragile moments, scoffing at the delicacies we had once nourished together, and I realized, standing frozen in a place that had once felt like home, that the hardest truth any parent could face isn't just about what we serve our children, but what we allow to fill their hearts. Ida for suggesting my teacher host my son's party at her house? It all started innocently enough. My son Ethan had turned 8, and in the excitement of planning his birthday party, I wanted to make it unforgettable. After all, this was the age where friendships began to solidify, and I wanted Ethan to feel special. I had toyed with the idea of renting a hall or throwing a backyard barbecue, but nothing felt quite right. It needed a personal touch, something more intimate. That's when I remembered Ms. Keller, Ethan's third-grade teacher, who had been nothing short of extraordinary. She had a way of bringing magic into mundane lessons, turning math classes into treasure hunts and history into exciting adventures, and I thought, why not? It was a bit of a stretch, but her massive Victorian-style house, filled with books and nooks, could be the perfect backdrop for a meaningful gathering. I approached her after school one day, my heart pounding in my chest, and suggested it as a wild idea. To my surprise, she considered it. Her smile softened into something more contemplative, as she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and nodded thoughtfully, but she never agreed. Weeks passed, and the conversation slipped from memory until I received a text from her, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, where she revealed she had been thinking about hosting the party at her house after all, citing how her own children loved the space. My heart soared. It was the answer I'd dreamed of, and I quickly agreed. The days leading up to the party were filled with excitement and anticipation. Every time Ethan smiled or laughed, I felt like I was on top of the world, relishing the fact that my crazy idea had manifested into reality. Then, the night of the party came. The kids flooded into Ms. Keller's grand home. Laughter echoed through her hallways, filled with the sweet scent of homemade cookies and the sound of balloons popping. I was caught up in a whirlwind of joy, glancing at Ms. Keller, who seemed to glide effortlessly between the children, her voice a gentle breeze among the giggles, until everything took a strange turn. Around 9, when half the kids were exhausted, I noticed Ethan drifting toward the basement door, which was slightly ajar, hesitant fingers reaching for the handle. "Ethan, no." I called out, the warning tearing from my lips as I rushed toward him, a sudden chill creeping into my veins. Ms. Keller was right behind me, her smile flickering as she gently reprimanded him, offering a promise of games and laughter above, but the glint in her eyes turned steely for the briefest second, sending a shiver crawling up my spine. I dismissed the incident, attributing my unease to exhaustion, and helped set up the cake. But the atmosphere thickened as the night wore on, the joyous laughter stagnant against an ill wind that seemed to seep in from nowhere. I watched as one by one, the children began to act strangely. They would pause mid-laugh, eyes wide as if something had whispered their names. The cake remained untouched, and the adults murmured amongst themselves, glancing nervously at the basement door that somehow drew attention like a gaping maw ready to swallow the unwary. It creaked open again, and I lost my breath when I saw tiny shadows moving in the dimness, figures that looked like children but were all wrong, limbs out of proportion, faces stretched or twisted in unnatural ways. One child, my neighbor's son, stumbled back up the stairs and pointed a trembling finger toward the door, and I suddenly realized none of the kids had gone in, but rather, something had come out. Ms. Keller quickly ushered them away, her demeanor shifting, sternness painting her features. I was struck by a sense of dread deeper than fear. I fumbled for my phone, frantically attempting to call the police when Ms. Keller approached, an unsettling calm settling over her. "Everything's fine, really," she said, her voice smooth like honey but edged with steel. "Just let them play." Then she looked beyond me and smiled, but I could feel it, a wave of malevolence rolling off her as the basement door creaked open wider, and a chilling breeze clawed at my back. Panic bubbled up inside me as I gripped Ethan's arm and started toward the door, but the children were transfixed, eyes locked on the darkness below. "You're being silly," Ms. Keller whispered with a hint of irritation, glancing over at the basement while the lights flickered ominously. "They just want to play a game." I felt the icy grip of dread tighten around me. The playfulness of the party had warped into something grotesque, as if the children were entranced by the shadowed figures whispering promises they could not resist. I turned and bolted for the door, dragging Ethan with me, but behind me, I could hear Ms. Keller's sweet voice laced with something sinister. "Ethan, we have so much more fun to have down here," she beckoned, her tone shifting like the wind, and everything in me screamed to flee. I yanked him toward the exit just as chaos erupted. The children screamed, not in delight but in pure terror as the twisted forms slinked further into the light, and the laughter turned into shrieks. I burst through the front door, practically tearing Ethan into the night as the darkness behind me stirred, shadows swirling like tempests through Ms. Keller's home. The last thing I saw before slamming the door shut was her eyes, two glimmering voids that seemed to absorb both light and life. We didn't stop running until we reached our car parked at the end of the street, panting and gasping as I shoved Ethan into the passenger seat, fumbling for my keys. It wasn't until we were far away, the glow of Miss Keller's charming house in the distance, that I dared to glance at him, and when I did, everything felt wrong. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but a strange, otherworldly calm, and I realized with dawning horror that he had begun to mimic the same expression I had seen on those twisted children. I glanced back at him, trying to shake off the terror, desperate to hold on to the warmth of normalcy, and as the night deepened around us, doubt crept in. Did I just ruin my son's birthday, or had I unwittingly invited something far worse? I shuddered thinking of Ms. Keller, now a blend of menace and charm, waiting at the edge of darkness for another innocent soul, and with each mile, a single thought screamed in my mind: was this all my fault? I never thought I'd be the one caught in a tug-of-war over life and death, but when my father chose to prioritize his fiancée's surgery over my own, I couldn't help but feel like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. The moment I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, everything spiraled from familiarity to sheer panic. My required surgery was life or death, an urgent fix to a ticking time bomb inside me. My dad, who had always been both my rock and my tormentor, became distant as soon as his new fiancée entered the picture, an almost cartoonish figure with a flashy smile and an obsession with yoga that somehow transformed my father from the caring dad I remembered into an oblivious shell wrapped around her every whim. I still remember the day it all shattered. I had been staring at the sterile hospital ceiling with its bright lights flickering like the last breaths of hope when my father strolled in, a confident grin plastered on his face, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Guess what?" he exclaimed, shattering my concentration. "Diane finally got the necessary approval for her surgery. It's next week." My heart raced, not from excitement, because I knew my surgery was also scheduled for next week, meant to save me from the darkness lurking within. I stared at him, mouth dry and words tangled in my throat, my mind racing with confusion and anger. "What about my surgery, Dad?" I asked, my voice a tremor against the cold efficiency of the room. All he could muster was a casual wave of his hand, a gesture that felt like a dismissive slap to my very existence. "Summer, sweetie, Diane needs this. It's a tough procedure, and I want to be there for her." At that moment, it dawned on me that I was no longer the priority in his life. His fiancée was the one who needed nurturing, love, attention, everything I had hoped my father would give me as I faced the specter of death. The reality hit me like 1,000 tiny hammers. He chose her over me, and I felt discarded, like a broken toy with no real value. I spent the days leading up to my surgery in limbo, wondering how blood could run thicker than water when mere affection had suddenly paled in comparison to a woman who gained my father's affection only recently. I didn't understand how he could be so blind, so utterly subsumed by her charm that he neglected the urgency of what was at stake, his own flesh and blood. On the day of the operation, nurses wheeled my gurney down the long, sterile hall, and as I passed the waiting area, I spotted him. He sat there, hand clasped over hers, laughing at something she said, laughing at the uncertainties of life, completely oblivious to my imminent fate. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not with fear of the surgery but with rage and betrayal. They were just at the other end of the hallway, and as I was rolled on by, the moment felt like a goodbye, like I was surrendering myself to the uncertain void, pushed aside for someone who had only stepped into the picture months before. I woke up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, feeling as though I had been torn from one world and thrown into another. Dazed, I scanned the room, hoping against hope to see my dad. Instead, only an empty chair remained. I called out to a nurse, my voice cracking, feeling abandoned and lost, needing comfort, just wanting to know I mattered, that I was worth fighting for. She offered a sympathetic smile and squeezed my hand gently. "He's with Diane, dear. She had a complication in her procedure." Those words struck me like a thunderous drum, the realization that I could have been lying in a casket, my father by her side, his heart beating for her while mine lay cold. The pain morphed inside me. It was no longer just physical but a fiery bitterness. I didn't care how selfish I sounded, I was allowed to feel anger at the man who chose someone else over his own daughter. Days merged together, and every time I found the strength to look for my dad, he was still there with her, spinning tales of shared laughter while I lay bruised and silent in the hospital. When we finally spoke, I confronted him, my emotions overflowing like a flood, raw and unrestrained. "You chose her, Dad. You chose her over me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You took her side, and I was alone." The silence that followed was the sharpest knife through my heart. A slow realization washed over him, but all I saw reflected back was disbelief. "No, it wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice thick with panic. "You're my daughter. You know that." But the words rang hollow, echoes drifting into the void where our bond had once thrived. I left the hospital feeling like I had lost more than my father. I had lost the last semblance of family I clung to, my will to fight diminished by someone who never cared to unravel the damage she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and news of Diane's shaky recovery filled my dad's voice every chance he got while still making excuses for his absence in my life. When I learned she was finally stabilized, I confronted my dad one last time. "You have to make a choice," I whispered, my heart racing as adrenaline coursed through me. "It's either me or her. You can't have both, not while I'm fighting for my life and she's taking everything from me." His face paled, and for the first time, I saw clarity in him, as if my words had finally threaded through the fog surrounding his mind. But instead of answering, he looked away, avoiding my gaze, and my heart shattered all over again. It was then I realized, the true betrayal wasn't his choice to love someone else, it was a choice he would always make, to love her more. Walking away from him that day felt like my own funeral, a weight lifting from my chest as I stepped into the cold air, a marionette severed from its strings. So, yeah, Ida for telling my dad he made a choice between me and his fiancée when he prioritized her surgery over mine? I don't think so. I just wanted him to see that he wasn't the only one who knew what it felt like to stand at the crossroads of life, and without him there to choose me, I simply had to learn to choose myself. It was a rainy Saturday morning, and the small coffee shop on the corner was packed, mirroring the storm outside with its chaotic energy. I managed to snag the last table, a tiny two-seater with a view of the dripping city streets, just as the door swung open to let in a gust of wind and a figure I would soon come to regret. She stumbled in, a wild-haired woman in a tattered raincoat, her face obscured by a tangle of frizzy curls, and for an instant, everything around me fell silent. She hovered in the doorway like some tragic specter. I caught a whiff of her as she approached the counter to order, and it hit me like a brick wall: sweat, rot and something I couldn't quite place, a medley of unkempt days stacked one atop the other like trash piling up in a back alley. I instinctively retracted my shoulders, suddenly hyper-aware of the people left standing in the queue, but they all wore expressions of discomfort, mirroring my own. Every instinct told me to maintain my distance. Her essence intruded upon the coffee shop's warm, cinnamon-tinged ambience. I was already watching people navigate between the tables, searching for a place to sit, and as I sipped cautiously on my overly sweet vanilla latte, I hoped she would find a corner where her smell wouldn't reach me. But life is never that simple. She approached my table, draped her coat over the back of the chair opposite me, and smiled a toothy grin that felt more like a warning than anything else. "Is this seat taken?" she chirped, and the pit in my stomach deepened as the aroma clung to the air around us, a thick, suffocating blanket that made my brain scream for escape. I wanted to be polite, to tell her I was waiting for someone, but the words caught in my throat, twisted by the harsh reality of her scent clinging to every surface. Instead, I cleared my throat, forcing a strained smile. "Actually, I'm just waiting for a friend," I replied, emphasizing the word friend like it was a sacred charm. She blinked and leaned in closer, the stench intensifying as if she had inhaled all the miseries of the world and exhaled them right in my direction. "Oh, come on, there's no need for that," she said, her voice a strange mix of persistence and desperation that instantly spat in the face of my discomfort. "It's a crowded place, just a quick sit until they find a seat." I felt my throat tighten further. I wanted to rise like a ghost, but the warmth of the latte paled in comparison to the cold, invading anxiety clawing at my chest. I could feel the eyes around us narrow in scrutiny, silently judging me, and I knew that I had to stand my ground because the alternative was unthinkable. I shook my head slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I'm sorry, but I really can't. I need some space." The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the whole cafe held its breath, waiting for her reaction. Her expression shifted from surprise to something darker, a flicker of indignation igniting beneath the surface of her frazzled exterior. "You're really going to turn me away? Just because of how I smell?" she hissed, her voice dropping low yet piercing, echoing between tables, punctuated by the clinking of mugs and muted chatter that seemed to suddenly fade into mere background noise. My chest tightened, caught between a wave of guilt and the suffocating dread of being captured by her discomfort. I wanted to scream to the world that I wasn't the bad guy here, that this wasn't about her as a person, that my senses were fighting a losing battle against her reality. But it was too late. In her narrowed eyes, I saw the slow dawning realization that I might be one of the few people refusing to let her presence invade their space. She sat back, huffing, shoulders slumping, tail between her legs. I could tell she felt it, the weight of her own isolation, the lack of kindness in an unfriendly world, but I was drowning, gasping for clean air. That's when she leaned forward again, eyes alight with something indefinable, an unsettling spark swirling behind them. You know, there's a name for people like you. They call you made of money and you turn your back on someone who just needs to rest. You won't remember this moment, you'll move on with your perfect, clean life while I'm left here in the dirt you won't even acknowledge. I braced myself for a possible outburst, but every moment of tension bent its spine back upon itself, wrapping the room in an atmosphere thick with anticipation. I wanted to hurl my guilt at her, to explain that I didn't have a perfect life, I had bills that made me sweat in my sleep and deadlines that haunted me. But her words cut deeper, and I found myself staring down into my latte, the froth swirling like crowded thoughts in my mind as shame crept over me like a thief in the night. I'm not the bad guy here, I attempted to insist, voice trembling with uncertainty and helplessness, but I was drowning in her eyes, the raw emotion behind them flaying the fabric of my justification. Then, slowly, she straightened, mouth a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't the laughter of someone who found joy, it was the brittle kind that echoed of deep wounds and ancient hurts that made me wonder how often had she been ridiculed in this very way. Anger flared briefly at the edge of my thoughts, casting shadows of self-doubt into the void. Was I really the monster I'd been painted to be? The onlookers shifted in discomfort. It appeared to be a performance now, a spectator's sport of empathy versus survival. The barista even paused as she made cappuccinos, casting sideways glances at us as the mayhem unfolded. I wish I could have shrunk down into the woven fabric of the chair, to escape the twisted narrative taking form. You know what, she said finally, a dangerous confidence threading her voice, you might think you're better than me now, but if you saw what I saw, if you felt what I feel, you'd run screaming into the night. My stomach churned as her words slithered into my mind, sharp and sinuous, and I did not want to imagine. We were worlds apart, yet standing in the same coffee shop, and I wasn't proud of the thoughts rolling through my head, thoughts that toyed with my sanity, testing the limits of my own humanity. I could hear my heart pounding within the petrified silence, the air thick as if the rain outside had seeped into our souls. Every interaction matters, she hissed, leaning closer still, unyielding. I held my breath, feeling myself unravel, wishing for the comfort of ignorance, and just when I thought it couldn't get worse, she added, you think you understand what hell smells like, don't you? The way she said it settled into my mind, twisting something deep inside me that tasted like regret and fear. I suddenly feared she could see through my facade, peel back my parameters and expose all that lay in ruin beneath. I was just about to protest, to shove her back into the abyss she claimed to know so intimately when, without a moment's warning, her left hand moved with precision to her coat pocket. Instinctually, I shrank back, my heart racing, wondering what she could possibly produce from that tangle of fabric. But then a glint caught the light, and in the size of an instant, I realized it was a small brass key, the kind you might find in an old hotel room. You know, ever since I showed up, you have been hating this moment, she whispered fiercely. But I could set you free, you know? I keep the worst of them at bay, all you have to do is ask. My gaze darted around the coffee shop, searching desperately for a sign of absurdity, for anyone to back me, but their eyes had diverted, and I was left tethered to this strange, grim pact looming at the fringes of sanity. What are you talking about? I challenged, although I sounded more confused than defiant. She leaned closer still, and I felt the unmistakable sting of desperation and danger weaving through the air. I know people think I smell bad, but you don't understand. There are demons where you can't see, they cling to people who let them in. I've held them back. You don't have to live with that fear. I shook my head, shifting back in my chair, but she moved closer until her breath grazed my face. Let me show you. I couldn't shake the sensation sprinting up my spine, her hand twitched like it was beckoning me to reach out. Then it was as if the world around us fell away, like I was in a dark vessel with no exit, feeling hovering eyes that weighed heavy upon my back. The scent, the woman, everything converged into a living nightmare before it struck me how wretchedly hopeless I felt. Was it wrong to reject her? Was I complicit in her suffering? The air was thick with a bittersweet kind of tension, like looking in the mirror and not recognizing who stared back. And in that fleeting moment, I could hear whispers creeping down the edges of reality, muddying the waters of my sanity. You could run, she was saying, but wouldn't you be curious? Wouldn't you want to know what you push away, what you so readily abandon in your comfortable life? Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to refuse, to go back to my latte and the momentary safety of shallow pleasantries, but I felt something else kindle inside me. I leaned slightly closer, just a breath as I murmured, "What do I need to do?" The laughter returned, twisted and sharp, but then her expression shifted, and she froze, eyes glimmering with sanity and chaos interspersed. "Nothing, really. Just acknowledge what is around you. Just for one moment." And then in that celebrated whiplash, I gasped as she broke into a wide grin and suddenly the cafe fell silent. I twisted my head around like a puppet on strings to see what lay behind me, but there wasn't anything there, just the reflective glass that taunted my confusion. "Your demons are real, but they take many shapes," she continued, voice low and mesmerizing, and in that inward feeling, the vibrations of anxiety raced up my throat. The key suddenly felt immensely heavy in her hand, like it was holding a world I couldn't comprehend. "Acknowledge them, and you might find what really haunts you isn't me at all." And just like that, a shiver coursed up my spine, underlining the unsettling reality that perhaps I shouldn't have pushed her away, perhaps I would walk out of this coffee shop and carry her stench with me, her essence following, wrapped around my neck like a noose tightening with every breath. What turned from laughter shifted back to suspicion again, and the weight of the moment crashed down, but it was too late. I was scared, held captive by the disconcerting truth behind my own choices, and as the crowd connected with fleeting uncertainty, this woman, in her tattered raincoat, had opened the door to something buried deep within. Darkness doesn't require permission, it just waits in the shadows, waiting to devour you whole while you dismiss those looking for refuge, blurring the lines between safety and fear. I straightened, the coffee shop's familiarity almost gone, as her stormy eyes implored me to see beyond my aversion. And deep down, as the rain thrummed against the windows and people shifted in their chairs, I realized I might have made a choice in that moment, a choice that I would come to reckon with long after we parted ways. The coffee shop could never provide the safety I craved, only a fleeting mask over hidden truths. My heart raced in anticipation of what lay beyond, and I suddenly needed more than just my latte. I needed to discover the depths of those demons lurking just out of sight, ready to carve a path I wouldn't soon forget. It was meant to be a simple first hangout, just me and Jenna, who I'd been crushing on since the moment I saw her in that crowded cafe, her laughter spilling like sunlight over the murky coffee. So when she invited me to a hike in the woods, I didn't think twice. I picked her up, my heart racing as I wondered if she'd notice my overenthusiastic cologne masking the scent of my nerves. The trail was gorgeous, dappled with autumn leaves, the air crisp and cool, and her presence felt electric, sending jolts of warmth through me even as the temperature dropped. As we trekked deeper into the woods, I found myself lost in conversation, trading stories about our childhoods and awkward high school moments, every laugh pulling us closer, every shared secret feeling like a pact. But as we reached a clearing glinting with sunlight, Jenna shivered slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. She glanced at my oversized sweater, and with a playful grin, she asked if she could borrow it, clearly not ready for the chill settling in as the sun dipped below the horizon. My instinct was to shrug it off and give it to her, but something about her request sent an icy tingle down my spine. Maybe it was that acute awareness of how easily one moment could shift into an entirely different reality. I hesitated, looking into her eyes, which flickered with both surprise and disappointment at my pause, and I finally said, "I think I'd rather not. It's, my favorite," which was a total lie, but I didn't know why I felt the need to withhold it. The flinch that crossed her face was subtle yet profound, but she quickly brushed it off, and we resumed our hike, the laughter now tinged with a hint of unease that I couldn't shake. The sun was almost gone, splattering the sky in streaks of orange and purple that felt surreal against the looming shadows that began to swallow the path we hadn't even realized we had ventured off. As we walked, the air turned heavy, and I noticed the woods felt different, as if everything was holding its breath, and I half wondered if the forest itself had come alive, watching our every step. We stumbled upon an old cabin, partially obscured by gnarled trees, its windows like empty eyes staring into the wilderness, and Jenna seemed drawn to it, almost against her will. I felt the instinct to grab her arm when she stepped towards the door, but it felt absurd. I wasn't her protector, just the guy who refused to give her my sweater. As if sensing my hesitation, Jenna turned to me, her expression eerily blank for someone who had just been speaking so animatedly. "Let's go check it out," she said with a tone that felt oddly detached, and despite every warning bell clanging in my mind, I followed her inside, the door creaking as if lamenting the intrusion. Inside, the air hung thick and musty, with wooden beams that groaned under the weight of years forgotten. Shadows cast by our flashlights flickered across the walls, revealing remnants of a life abandoned, a broken chair, dust-coated dishes piled in the corner. But one thing struck me as we explored: it felt wrong, almost like we had stepped into a scene that was not ours to witness. Jenna laughed suddenly, her voice echoing oddly in the silence, but when I turned to her, I saw that the darkness had drawn something out of her, her eyes dancing with a strange light that pulled at my gut. "I feel so liberated, don't you?" "Like we're breaking the rules," she said, her smile wide but unsettling, as if she was channeling some hidden energy swirling in the air. That was when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I backed away slowly, sensing something sinister lurking behind that innocent facade, but she caught me by the wrist, her grip firm yet fragile, a mix of desperation and allure. I wanted to pull away, to leave, but the intensity of her gaze held me in place, paralyzing with both fear and fascination. "Stay with me, just a bit longer," she whispered, and that was when I noticed shadows, long, curling shapes that seemed altogether too alive, creeping toward us from the corners of the cabin. Panic surged through me, the overpowering urge to flee clashing violently with my desire to keep Jenna close, but as I pried her fingers away and turned to run, a whisper echoed through the timbers, silky and suggestive yet dripping with malice: "You shouldn't have denied her the comfort of your warmth." I scrambled toward the door, my heart racing, but the shadows twisted and writhed, blocking my escape as Jenna's voice shifted, tinged now with desolation. "You'll regret this," she murmured, and beneath that familiar exterior, I caught a flicker of something else, something ancient and wrong that sent a chill ripping through my spine. As I finally shoved past the barrier of darkness and burst into the night, the weight of my decision crushed me. Was it worth it, not letting her borrow my sweater? The forest around me pulsed with an urgent energy as the last vestiges of light faded into the obsidian sky, and I sprinted back toward my car, glancing over my shoulder just once to see Jenna standing in the doorway of the cabin, her figure swallowed by shadows, but for a brief moment, she appeared almost ethereal, a desire woven into every sinew of her being. My heart clenched as I fumbled with my keys, entering the vehicle and slamming the door behind me, the haunting whispers still carving their way into my skull. I drove home in a daze, that night swirling in my mind as I grappled with what transpired, chills cascading down my body despite the warmth of my heater, wondering if I had just barely escaped something that could have consumed me whole. Now, days later, I replay the moment, obsession gnawing at my sanity, never quite shaken from the haunting image of Jenna, curiously beautiful yet impossibly insidious, but every time I try to shake off the fear, I hear her voice in my dreams, softly echoing, "You should have just let me wear your sweater." When my fiancé, Tom, and I decided to move into our first home together, I imagined the smiles, laughter, and warmth we would fill it with, but everything changed the day I voiced my concern about his cousin's girlfriend, Clara. Clara had always rubbed me the wrong way, her laughter too loud, her words too cutting, and one particularly unsettling memory of a family barbecue haunted me. She cornered me, her cold eyes glinting with mischief, and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, about my past struggles with anxiety, painting me as some fragile, broken person. I brushed it off back then. Family dynamics can be complex, and feigned a smile while the red crept up my neck. But as moving day approached, I felt a creeping dread about the idea of her plopping on our new couch, treating our space like her personal stage. So, in an attempt to safeguard our peace, I brought it up to Tom, explaining how uncomfortable it made me to think she'd feel entitled to our home, that I just didn't want her to bring her drama and condescension into this new chapter of our lives. To my shock, he looked at me like I'd slapped him, his brows knitted in confusion, as he insisted that family gatherings were meant to be inclusive, and Clara was part of that family, and somehow it spiraled into a heated argument where he accused me of being controlling, selfish, not understanding the importance of his family to him, and in that moment, I felt the weight of isolation as he doubled down on inviting her, claiming I was overreacting, that I was the one causing a rift between us. I found myself in the eye of a storm I couldn't comprehend, where my feelings meant nothing, and he chose blood over the woman he was supposed to love most. It shattered me, and I felt like a villain in my own life, a true the fiancé versus the cousin's girlfriend tale playing out in a twisted sense of irony, and I thought of the odd glances she wouldn't hesitate to throw at me whenever Tom wasn't around, her calculated remarks piercing like daggers, but I kept quiet. When moving day arrived, the last thing I wanted was conflict, so I plastered on a smile and welcomed the chaos that came with a dozen family members stepping over boxes and trailing dirt onto our floors, but deep down I could feel that storm brewing. I'd already warned Tom, hadn't I? As the day unfolded, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter, and amidst the crowded living space, there appeared Clara, strutting in like she owned the place, her outfit representing some twisted version of classy. I felt an unsettling heaviness in my chest, and I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment of sanity, hoping a few deep breaths could drown out the noise. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the cold glass against my sweaty palm when suddenly Clara appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with that same mocking grin. "Aren't you tired of pretending to be the perfect fiancé? Or does he not mind that you're really just a little weirdo?" she said, taking a deliberate step closer as if to intimidate me. Panic bubbled within me, and all the moments I had held back came flooding to the surface. I blurted out that she was unwelcome in our home. Silence. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of garlic and roasted chicken, turned so still it felt like I had yanked out the air from the room. Time slowed as her expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smirk tinged with malice. "You really think a little boundary will save you? This is not just your house, this is our family, dear," she hissed, emphasizing the word "our" with venom that sent chills down my spine. It was at that moment, watching her intense gaze penetrate through my facade, that I realized I had inadvertently wedged myself deep into a battle I was bound to lose. The wall between us felt insurmountable, and when I finally emerged from that kitchen, it was to a scene that felt surreal. Tom caught in a web of confusion and frustration as Clara spilled the beans about our little confrontation. The smiles turned into whispers as a funeral-like hush descended over our guests. I could see some looking at me in pity, others stunned, and the dagger of humiliation plunged deeper into my already frayed nerves. It felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground trembling beneath me, and in a split second of sheer panic, I realized I was not the only one threatened by this shattering tension. Tom's eyes flashed with anger, disappointment, and betrayal, and before I could explain, I felt the cold weight of the room's judgment tighten around my throat. He turned to me, voice low and trembling. "Why would you do that? Why would you make a scene?" It struck me like a slap in the face, heartbreaking because this wasn't about me being the focus of the drama. I had only been trying to set the stage for a peaceful beginning, so why couldn't he see that? Determined to resolve the chaos, I tried justifying my feelings, asserting my need for boundaries, but all I got in return was the flicker of anger in his eyes, a refusal to understand. Clara was still smirking, her victory evident as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, soaking in every moment of my humiliation. I felt as if I was the intruder in my own life, torn between my love for Tom and the need for self-respect, my very existence reduced to a battle over territory, and I finally spoke the truth, that I wasn't comfortable with Clara slipping in and out of our lives like she was a part of the furniture, and that anger transformed into terrible isolation as Tom stepped back, shaking his head, whispering that I didn't know how to play nice with family, that I would always be an outsider to his world. The words pierced deeper than anything Clara could have said. I stood there, wrestling with waves of despair, realizing the nightmare was not just her presence but the fact that I was losing him. It felt surreal in the aftermath as people hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to support me or defend him, the tension strangling the air, collapsing my hopes of love into ashes. I tried to refuse Clara's smug smile, but the reality sunk in like the darkness gathering around me. This was never going to end well, and as the night dragged on, I watched Tom grow more frustrated, more distant, and I realized that in trying to stand my ground, I had unwittingly dug a grave for our relationship, slowly trapped in a dissonance that had settled over both our lives, one that made me question if I was the villain or merely a puppet pulled by strings of a vengeful fate. Now the boundaries blurred, and all I could wish for was to rewind. Instead, I found myself waking up in our new home alone the next morning, losing sight of the dreams I once had, staring at the walls which felt less like comfort and more like a cage filled with memories of regret, uncertain whether Tom would choose to fight for us or slide into the shadows, where Clara lurked, waiting to further her twisted campaign against the fragile remnants of what remained of our love. I never thought I'd be that guy who gets grossed out by his girlfriend, but here I am, sitting in my dimly lit bedroom, heart racing and palms sweaty, wondering if I'm overreacting or if there's something genuinely disturbing about the situation. My girlfriend, Lisa, is the kind of woman who could light up a room with her laughter. She's bright, funny, and has this magnetic smile that drew me in the moment we met at that dive bar last summer. But lately, something else has been drawing my attention, and it's not as pleasant as her charm. It started small. She'd skip washing her hair for a day or two, saying she liked the natural oils or didn't want to ruin her waves, but after a few weeks, it became clear to me that this was more than just a beauty routine, it was an outright neglect. I hesitated, thinking maybe it was a phase or some personal statement she was making about embracing herself, but by week 3, I couldn't ignore the pungent odor that lingered in the air after she left the room. It was like the smell of damp earth mixed with something rancid, and I tried to brush it off as a trivial inconvenience. We'd hang out at my place, and out of desperation, I would spray air freshener when she wasn't looking, hoping she'd catch a whiff and feel compelled to wash up, but instead, she just kept piling on the dry shampoo, like it was some magical solution. One night, we were on the couch, cuddling while watching a movie, and I caught a whiff that made me gag, subtle but thick enough to linger, and I couldn't help but pull away. The look she gave me was one of confusion and hurt, as if I had slapped her across the face, and that was the moment I knew I had to say something. "Lisa, can we talk?" I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think you need to wash your hair more often." I braced myself for a fight, but instead of anger, she just laughed, that carefree laughter that had enchanted me so many times, now tinged with disbelief. "You're kidding, right? It's just hair. Who cares?" But I could see her self-assurance crack a little, the laughter not reaching her eyes. The days turned into weeks, each one more unbearable than the last. As we spent time together, her hair became a distressing presence. It was always stringy and looked like it was home to a family of grease rats. I felt disgusting just sitting next to her. Friends and family began to notice too, dropping pointed hints that couldn't go unaddressed. At dinner, my sister casually asked, "Are you okay, Lisa? You're not looking your best lately." I felt that crushing embarrassment swell in my chest, the ball of conflict growing larger every time I pulled Lisa close. One night after work, I walked into our apartment, fully ready to be hit by that noxious cloud she now carried like a perfume, but what greeted me was oddly still. The whole place felt off balance, eerily quiet, and I immediately feared the worst. I wandered through the dim light, finding her bedroom door slightly ajar. I nudged it open, revealing the bed a mess of clothes and crumbs, but no Lisa. A sickening knot formed in my stomach as I turned to check the bathroom. The moment I stepped inside, reality twisted in a sickening way. The mirror was fogged up, and her hairbrush sat abandoned on the countertop, but where was she? The thought struck me like a lightning bolt that maybe she'd finally cracked. I found myself pacing the room, mind spiraling with worries, until I noticed the open window, and then I remembered something. She had mentioned a friend down the street hosting an art exhibit that night, so I grabbed my coat and rushed out, panic driving my feet. Arriving at the gallery, the vibrant colors painted walls contrasted sharply with the raw anxiety gnawing at my insides. I scanned the crowd, searching for her face, but found only strangers chatting and sipping wine. A wave of unease crashed over me. Where could she have gone? Just as I was about to text her, something deep within me prompted me to check the restroom. I pushed through the throng of bodies moving like a tide toward the bar, and as I reached the flickering light of the restroom sign, my breath caught in my throat. I could hear muffled laughter from inside, and I paused, my heart pounding. Forcing the door open, I stepped inside, and there she was, standing in front of the sink, her hair splayed out like a tangled mess, a friend from work, Jennifer, beside her. They both stopped laughing when they saw me, and the moment of silence hung heavy in the air, thick with all the things left unsaid. I stood frozen, my mouth working but unable to form words. "What's wrong, babe?" Lisa said, tugging a strand of greasy hair behind her ear, the innocence in her voice cutting deeper than any knife. My thoughts raced as I looked back and forth between the two of them. There was something unsettling about the way they were giggling, the way Lisa couldn't seem to feel the weight of the revolting crust forming on her scalp. Then Jennifer leaned closer and whispered something that sent chills racing down my spine. "It's only hair, right? It's like art, the messier, the better." Just like that, panic morphed into a visceral horror, and I stumbled backward, suddenly understanding that this wasn't a phase, this wasn't just about hygiene, but something far more sinister I hadn't grasped. An hour passed, and I was sitting outside, shivering not from the chill of the night, but the creeping realization that I couldn't be with someone who had willingly chosen to let themselves go so profoundly. I could hear the muffled noise behind me, laughter ringing out, but it all felt distant, strange. What kind of life did I want? Was I disgusted because I actually thought she was disgusting, or was my disgust a reflection of my own expectations of normalcy? When I went home that night, I tried to shake it off, but all I could think was that I felt trapped in a relationship that had dove deep into the abyss, her carefree attitude now looming over me like a shadow, leaving me pondering how far I would have to go to escape this tangled mess of love and revulsion. I texted her, "We need to talk," and waited, the screen flashing with those 3 little dots, and when she finally replied, it felt like the exhale I'd been holding for too long. "Can we talk about your hair?" I typed, my fingers trembling, but the response came quickly, and all at once, I wondered if it was really worth it to try and salvage what was left of us. Ida for being disgusted that my girlfriend doesn't wash her hair for weeks. The loneliness devoured me, as I realized I was getting sucked into the whirlpool of our differences, fighting with a growing sense of dread that maybe, just maybe, I'd be forced to choose between love and a life governed by a cleanliness I once took for granted.